So the idea was to create the computational model of the brain. Neurologists, people who studied brain, they knew for a fairly significant amount of time that, that brain matter consists of the so-called neurons and synapses connecting those neurons. Now, it was not quite clear at that time what they were actually doing. So some kind of a biochemical process takes place. And some of those neurons become excited, so they change their state. And when they become excited, the excitation can get propagated. And the assumption was that it propagates along the connections. And there are very intricate connections between different neurons in our brain. Okay? Now, in terms of modeling it computationally, the first breakthrough happened during the Second World War. Two researchers named McCulloch and Pitts published a paper in 1943, where they proposed a computational model of a neuron. And that computational model of a neuron was the model of a linear threshold element. Okay. Well, here they talk about this fact that you can actually, let me talk a little bit about McCulloch and Pitts. So what is a linear threshold element? This is basically that threshold function that I described before. So what is a linear threshold function? So you have a weighted sum of the inputs. If that weighted sum is below a certain threshold, then the neuron is not excited. If that weighted sum exceeds a predefined threshold, then that neuron changes from this excited condition, from unexcited condition to the excited condition, and you can think of it as the inputs and the output. So there is this input that is going on, and the output, which can be either 0 or 1, or +1 or -1, depending how you model this, right? Which represents this excited condition or not excited condition. Now, as I said, that was done in the mid-1940s. So when people started thinking about artificial intelligence, and we talked about the fact that in the 1950s, there were advances, and well, people started thinking about before. Alan Turing was thinking and came up with the famous Turing test. But when computers became available, people started writing programs. Right? So people tried to write programs to play chess and imitate some other activities. Claude Shannon, who before the war became one of the pioneers of cybernetics, when he was at Bell Labs, wrote a program how to trade stocks. And he even had a lawsuit with Bell Labs because Bell Labs claimed that the program belonged to them. And Claude Shannon claimed that he wrote it in his spare time. And Bell Labs claimed that according to his contract, his brain had no spare time. So whatever his brain produced belonged to Bell Labs. So it's an interesting story. But there were people who said, well, why don't we try to create a computational model of the brain? So instead of trying to come up with specific algorithms that would learn to do specific things, why don't we create a universal computational model of the brain? And then, whatever problem we have at hand, we just throw that problem onto that model so humans can learn, so that computational model of the brain can learn as well. Okay? And there was a lot of excitement in the 1950s, and there were thick books written in the late 1950s, early 1960s, where actually people interconnected those linear threshold elements and tried actually to develop ways how to modify the weights of the input to achieve desirable results. So how you interconnect it defines various types of, they call it, neural network architecture. Okay. And there was a great optimism that, you know, no matter what the problem is, if you create a sufficiently complicated architecture of a neural network, you will be able to solve that problem. Okay? So all that party kept going on until the late 1960s, when two young researchers at MIT, Minsky and Packard, well, mid-60s, first wrote an article and then wrote a book. Not a very long one, by the way. Those books from the 50s, I had some of them were like 600, 700 pages. So Minsky and Packard Perceptrons, I believe it was published in 1968. I don't remember, I think it was something like 100 pages, 150 pages. It was a fairly thin book. So they actually showed a pretty devastating argument. They showed particular problems, and they proved that you cannot create a neural network to solve that problem. So, and you cannot train that neural network. So it was difficult. One of the problems with the linear threshold elements is the fact that they're not differentiable. So as I told you, that function that I showed you, it has a discontinuity at that point. It's not a differentiable function. So if you cannot calculate derivatives, you are limited in what you can do. So what happened after that? It was a devastating result. So all that enthusiasm about neural networks was extinguished for almost 20 years. So people said, well, this is a dead end. It is not going to work. It is not an interesting area. Okay? So all that was continuing into the 1980s, when computers became much more powerful, optimization methods developed greatly, and some people started getting some great ideas that, you know what, why do we have to be married to that concept of linear threshold element? Okay, well, we understand that it looks like this is how the brain works, but this may not be the best way how to engineer a system that does things similar to what the brain does. So there was a group, one of the leading researchers was Bruno Hart. They published a book which was called Parallel Distributed Processing. It became known as a PDP book. And maybe many of you have heard about the so-called backpropagation algorithm in neural networks. Some of you have, right? So this is where it came from. So what was the basic idea? Well, the idea was, well, I mean, similar to what we already saw in this chapter on linear discrimination. Why don't we replace our linear threshold elements with sigmoids? Well, they're close enough, right? And we can make them actually behave almost like a linear threshold element. But we get a great benefit. Sigmoid is infinitely differentiable. So because of that, we can actually try to implement something like gradient methods, see what happens. So we feed some input into our network, so for a particular observation, right? So the inputs are typically the values of the input variables. So we feed the input into our network. The network does this calculation of the result, but it is now the sigmoids that calculate the results, right? And the output now is not a 0-1 output. The output of the sigmoid is not a 0-1 output, right? So that output we can feed into other elements, right? So, and keep doing calculations until the very end. So when we get to the end, say if it is a classification problem, we still have to make this 0 or 1 decision, right? But we have to make it only at the end. There is absolutely no reason why we have to deal with those non-differentiable transformations in the middle of the network. And then we can run basically like gradient descent algorithms. And if you do the calculation, they're called backpropagation because the architecture, it is known as the so-called feed-forward neural networks. So what is a feed-forward neural networks? It's like when you have the elements have the inputs and there is an output. So, and the outputs feed into some other element. So you can imagine it as arranged either from the bottom up or from the left to the right. But basically this propagation of calculation goes in one direction only. Okay? There are other arrangements, there are other types of neural networks which are used for other things. For example, maybe you have heard about Kogan nets. This is where you have this network structure that keeps recalculating, where there is no predefined output until it settles into a certain stable configuration. That's a totally different. But as far as our topic is concerned, say we are dealing with classification problems. So what we are trying to do, we are trying actually to assign the classification label. So we need to do this kind of feed-forward calculation. So in this feed-forward calculation, you have the output, which is the end result. And then you compare this output with what you want, right? If this output is not exactly what you want, like you saw before in the gradient methods, then there is a difference. Like we had r minus y, right? So that difference in error can be propagated back, and the weights will be adjusted proportionally to those differences along the way. This is what this gradient showed. So like what you saw in this linear case is implemented in this case, and this backpropagation algorithm turned out to be extremely efficient. So the story turned on its head almost overnight. From the late 1980s, pretty much until today. So there is this boom. So that neural winter, as it was called. So there is a period in neural network history which was called neural winter, which is 2 decades from the mid-60s to mid-80s, when people believed that that thing didn't work. All of a sudden turned into spring and then summer, and this is a very active area. So people were very excited, a lot of software implemented, this basic backpropagation algorithm and then different modifications of the backpropagation algorithm. So this is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. So I gave you this kind of historical overview just to give you an idea of what is going on. But this, in a way, it builds on what we just covered.